And so now it's after lunch, the blood's flowing to the intestinal tract, and it's time to make sure that we keep the entertainment value going. What we've got now is a couple of very eminent policy influencers, if I can use that term. We have Australia's answer to Brian Cox, Brian Schmidt, and who I think, as everybody knows, managed to get the Nobel Prize when, under his leadership, the High Z supernova search team managed to prove that the expansion rate of the universe was expanding, even accelerating, so that effectively proving that we really didn't know what the majority of the universe was. He's also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and the United States Academy of Science and the Royal Society, and a companion of the Order of Australia since 2013. And what Brian's been able to do is to use that profile to help develop policy influence, and I know that he'll take us through how to make use of that sort of influence. Not that the rest of us are going to be rock star Nobel laureates, but the type of balance that's required to make use of the contacts that you get out of your professional life to have some influence on policy. So Brian presented on that at Science Meets Policymakers, and I found it particularly very informative. And Hugh White is also here, Professor of Strategic Studies. Sorry, Hugh, I can't sort of introduce you as our Nobel laureate, but the National at the ANU, he's served as Senior Advisor on the staff of the Defence Minister, and as I very inappropriately shuffle my notes so that I don't get things wrong. Kim Beazley, the Prime Minister Bob Hawke, Deputy Secretary, as Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defence. So Hugh's got very keen insight and a wealth of experience in the policy making sphere, and has in the past, and I know will again, share with us some of that insight into how to influence that policy sphere. Although I'm nominally on the list as the MC, these two gentlemen are extreme professionals and will be able to MC themselves very well, so they'll make some presentations, and then there'll be, as before, a Q&A session. So please get engaged. As I say, try and get that blood flow a little bit higher up to the cerebellum, and let's see if we can have some engaging discussion. So I'll hand over to Hugh, who's going to start.
Good. Well, thanks, thanks, Ross, for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a particular privilege to share the platform with Brian, of course. And thanks also to Katrina and Gia and the team, who are always a pleasure to work with on these things. So my perspective on some of the issues of how science and policy interact is a little bit different in the sense that I'm very much not a scientist, and I'm really a policymaker turned academic. So although I have a foot in both camps, if you like, most of my career has been spent in and around the policy space rather than the academic space. And as a policymaker, I spent most of my career working in an area which is pretty science heavy, that is defence, where a lot of my responsibilities involved thinking about what kind of capabilities Australia should be buying, and so it was a very common experience for me to be sitting down at a table with a whole lot of scientists or engineers who knew a whole lot of stuff that I didn't know, and me trying to understand what it is that they could tell me that would help me do what I was meant to do. So I very much feel the pain from the other side of the table, if I can put it that way. So what I want to do is to just explore two really simple questions. The first is, how do policymakers think? And secondly, how do you get your ideas into their thoughts? And the reason I think it's worth asking that first question is that policymakers do think differently from you. And I really mean that. And I think it's very helpful to think about how you as scientists interact with the policy community at all levels, to recognise that they start from a very different, they start each conversation from a very different position than you. And the best way to summarise that, the brutalest way to summarise it is simply this. policymakers are not after the truth. Now that sounds a little bit cynical, but actually I mean it quite seriously, quite literally so. The aim of science is to create knowledge. And once you've created the knowledge, you've done the job. There it is. There's the data. There's the hypothesis confirmed by the data. That is new knowledge. Wonderful thing. But that's not what policymakers do. Their job is to make decisions. And making decisions is a very different kind of thing than making knowledge. And making decisions is right at the heart of what they do. Indeed, it's right at the heart of what government does. J.F. Kennedy once said, "To govern is to choose." He was bitching and moaning at the time about the fact that it seemed to be very hard to reach a decision. And he recognised that reaching a decision was what his job was. And the business of making decisions, how you make decisions well, is what government policy processes are all about. And trying to make them as well as possible is what good policymakers should always be aspiring to do. And it's a very different thing to try and do that than it is to try and create knowledge per se. And this is, in fact, quite an old idea. In fact, Aristotle, who is a respectable claim to be the father of logic and to a certain extent the father of science, spelled out this difference quite precisely. He obviously observed exactly the point I'm trying to make here, because he identified a whole lot of syllogisms, structures of argument that you as scientists would use every day, whether you know it or not, inductive and deductive logic, moving from a set of propositions to a conclusion which is new knowledge. And then he said, yes, but there's also something quite different called a practical syllogism. The conclusion of an inductive or deductive syllogism is a statement of knowledge. The conclusion of a practical syllogism is an action. That's a decision at work. That's decision making. And so that really fundamental distinction between the way you approach an issue of what you want to do is to create knowledge and the way you approach an issue of what you want to do is to reach a decision, start some action, get something done, is pretty significant. And it should inform everything that anyone has, that any person has, but particularly I would guess any scientist has, as they start to talk to policymakers, politicians or other policymakers, and start to engage with them on policy processes. It's a matter of always focusing on how your knowledge helps their decision and helping them do the translation from what you know to the decision they have to make is right at the heart of effective engagement in the policy process. And that leads to a couple of sort of preliminary conclusions. One is that when you think to yourself, how am I going to influence policy, how am I going to shape policy, you can think about that in two fundamentally different ways. One is to say, here's something I know. I want to go and persuade the policymakers that they should make a decision on the basis of it. And another is to ask, what's the decision that they're facing? What's the decision that the policymakers have to face? Now, how can I provide knowledge that helps them make that decision? A lot of interactions between scientists, or for that matter other professions, and policymakers have the first form. I know something and I want you to pay attention to it. Whereas by far and away the most successful interactions are the ones where you go to the policymaker and say, here's your problem, here is how I can help. And sometimes this can even in fact shape your research agenda if you choose to think of your objectives as a scientist in these terms. You should ask yourself not what's interesting, I hope it's interesting anyway, but what are the choices out there that policymakers are facing? What's the information they don't have to support that choice? How could I help to provide that? And often the most successful and effective contribution to policy-making processes occurs when people who have the professional space to build knowledge focus on building knowledge directly to support the decisions that the governments have to take. Now, to think about how that works, it helps just to dig a little bit deeper into the logic of policy, because it is in fact a little bit more complicated than Aristotle made out. And I think always was. I don't think this is just because of the effluxion of time. And the key reason for that is that resources are always part of the picture. We have a simple model of policy making, of decision making more broadly actually, a quite deeply intuitively embedded model, which says that we start up with an objective. We want to achieve such and such. We work out what the best way of doing that is. We work out how much that's going to cost, and then we do it. So the objectives are a priori, they're there at the beginning, and there's a linear process that takes you from resources, from objectives to means to resources. That's the end of the story. And a lot of people think that a lot of government decision making is like that, and it's not. It never is. And the reason for that is perfectly simple. Objectives are always dependent on resources. What you're trying to do always depends on how much it's going to cost you. And this is as true in your own life as it is in government work. But, you know, you decide you want to go on a holiday to Tanganyika, and then you discover that that's going to cost you $50,000, and you can go to Bali for $5,000. You decide to go to Bali instead. You change your objective to match your resources. And hunting up and down, adjusting your objectives until you can work out an objective that comes into balance with the money you're prepared to spend for the outcome. That's really what the policy process is all about. It's not at all a linear process. It's a very iterative process, and it involves a lot of hunting backwards and forwards. And that process of hunting backwards and forwards, what are we trying to do? How could we do it? How much would that cost? Are we really prepared to spend that amount of money to achieve that outcome? No, that's too much. Okay, let's reduce our objectives a bit. That kind of very dynamic interaction between objectives and costs is right at the heart of the policy process. And that's the process that you need to try and participate in if you're going to make your knowledge count to the way policy evolves. And that complicated process, you can spell it out. I mean, it's not complicated in theory, it's just complicated to make it work in day to day. It involves policymakers wrestling with a series of questions which can be reasonably briefly summarised. What is the problem? A huge amount of policy work goes to defining what the problem is in the first place, and a large proportion of bad policy arises from people not having defined what the problem is in the first place. Second big question is, why does it matter? And how much does it matter? Of course it matters that, for example, in a subject closer to my field than to yours, that social media is being used to recruit young Australians to go and fight in Iraq and Syria. Of course that matters. How much does it matter? You've always got to answer the how much question, because unless you know how much it matters, you don't know how much it's going to be worth spending to fix it. What are the options? What are the different ways we could approach managing this problem? Which one of those options is best, and how you define best becomes quite complicated. Of course, broadly it means most cost effective, but there's a lot in that concept. And can we afford it? Or rather, is the most cost effective solution to the problem as we've now defined it worth what it would cost us to implement it? And that series of questions, when you talk to policymakers, what you'll find is they're wrestling with one or other, sometimes more than one, of those questions simultaneously. And if you want to think your way into their shoes, talk to policymakers in policymakers' terms, participate in their process of trying to make decisions. You're going to have to work with them in answering those questions, and answer those questions for yourself. Now, an important part of recognising that is to see that the relationship between the data, the knowledge that underpins the decision, and the decisions themselves are not static. I think often from both sides, from the knowledge workers' side and the policymakers' side, there's a tendency to see that relationship a little bit like a builder building a wall, that you come to the policy question with some bricks of knowledge and you lay them down and you put them one on top of the other, and eventually you reach a conclusion, you create a conclusion. But in fact, the data shifts, of course, for all sorts of good reasons. The objectives keep on changing as people go through that policy cycle that I just sketched out. The kind of data that's relevant to the objectives as they're shifting changes along the way. And so what you end up with is a very dynamic relationship between the facts and the decisions, between the data and the decisions. And so rather than being like building a wall, it's more like playing tennis. You're there on the court if it's working, you're there on the court with the policymaker. they're doing something very dynamic, you're doing something very dynamic, and hopefully you're doing it in a way that interacts. Not necessarily the case that one person wins or the other, but I need a cooperative version of tennis. But the key question then for people like you is how much do you want to get out on that court and start playing that game? Well, who's on the other side of the court? In our system, of course, it is ultimately, and in many cases primarily, politicians. Don't believe the sort of the yes minister vision. Politicians really do make policy. But they're not the only players. Staffers, public service, all sorts of other stakeholders, and I know you'll have been hearing from some of those today, and of course, sometimes in a direct way, but always in an intermediary way, the media. And so getting out on the court, taking part in that complex interaction between data and decision, which is the policy-making process, involves you getting into the business with some or all of those, including the media themselves. It is worth bearing in mind that one of the reasons why it's worth engaging in the media, if you're interested in the policy business, is because that's what the policymakers read. I put quite a lot of my time into writing for the press, and sometimes very early on a Monday morning, which is when I normally do my regular column, it doesn't seem like a great idea, but I remind myself the reason I do it is not just that most of the people buying the newspaper or looking at it online might read it with a bit of luck, but I know the ministers well, and I know their staff well. It's a very good way of communicating with the specific audience you want. But of course, when you start talking like that, when you start thinking in those terms, then you start seeing yourself differently. It's a different kind of activity. You become a scientist, you think of yourself as being somewhat detached from some of those sorts of things, a person whose aim in life is to build knowledge. And there's an image that I can understand is very attractive of saying, my role in this is just to give the facts, up to somebody else to decide what to do with them. Now, there are some areas of policy to which that is to an extent possible. There's some areas of policy which are very fact-driven. Probably if you're dealing with, the pharmaceutical benefits, for example, then presumably medical science plays a very big role in that. But an awful lot of areas of policy, an awful lot of the most difficult areas of policy, are areas where the science does not dictate the outcome. It's just one of the inputs. And if you want your science to help shape the outcome by being one of those inputs and making it as influential as possible, you do have a tough choice to make yourself about what kind of role you play. Because to play the kind of role I've described, to get out onto the tennis court and start playing that game, to start working with policymakers to answer that list of questions I mentioned before, you have to do more than just give the facts. You have to start working with them, talking in their language. And if you don't do that, it will limit your impact. When people find it hard to make an impact, it's because they're trying to talk science to policymakers. They're trying to talk about truth and knowledge rather than about decisions. And the people on the other end of the line just aren't listening. They won't listen unless it's in language that really relates to what they have to do. So it will limit your impact. And that means you have to become a bit of an advocate. Now that's a difficult idea. Advocacy has a bit of a dirty word because it does suggest compromise and complexity and all of that sort of thing. To my mind, advocacy is just the business, of making up your own mind what you think the policy outcome should be, or at least what impact your knowledge should have on the policy outcome. So you have to start answering the policy questions for yourself if you're going to hope that your knowledge is going to make a difference to the policy outcomes, and then being prepared to go out and argue for that in just the way, although in different language, for the way you'd argue for a scientific result itself. And if that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, and I can understand why it would, I just encourage you to recognise the difference between advocacy and polemic. Advocacy, going out there and arguing for a policy outcome yourself, can be based, should be based, I would say, should always be based, on very rigorous analysis, on a very rigorous sense of the data, on very clear structures of judgments. It can be a very rigorous business. Polemic is different. Polemic is where you go out there and say what suits you ideologically, what you think will work for your career. It can be driven by ideology or ambition. Whereas advocacy, good advocacy, is always driven by the analysis. But not just the scientific analysis, it's also what goes on in the policy process itself. And in order to do that, you do have to think carefully about how you take part. You need to be willing to simplify what you know without distorting it, and that is a major intellectual challenge. You need to make what your input vivid so people pay attention to it without making it deliberately provocative. And that can also take a great deal of work, not one I necessarily always achieve in my own work. You've got to be willing to let your ideas go. One of the great things about policy making in the end is nobody owns the result except maybe the minister. And so whereas in a scientific or academic enterprise, one of the aims is to make sure your name is on the article where the knowledge is created, in the policy business you've got to throw your knowledge out there, throw your ideas out there and let them live by themselves. Letting them go is a very powerful thing. And of course, you must not be afraid of criticism, because it is a very contested space, and it's contested in a different tone sometimes to the way ideas are contested in the scientific community. Don't be afraid of criticism, don't be afraid to engage your critics, but always make sure that you engage them on the issues themselves and don't do what they will sometimes do, and that is start getting personal. So is this worth doing? Sounds like quite a lot of work. Well, I think it is. I mean, you might say you'd expect me to say that because I've spent my whole life in and around the policy world. But I do think that working in policy can be enormously satisfying. I can see in a way how for scientists in particular, the current experience, particularly the debate over climate change, might be a bit demoralising about the role of science in public policy. It's been a very difficult issue for both sides of that debate. I think it's a very interesting question about where that story itself is going, but the broader point I want to make is it's not typical. Very commonly, real knowledge does make a real difference to making good policy, and you don't want to be too scared by examples where it sometimes goes bad. And it's also worth bearing in mind that despite the yes minister image, politicians and the public service, the rest of the people in the business on the other side of the table, so to speak, are 95% of the time serious about a good outcome. You know, it's very easy for us to dismiss politicians as not serious people. Most of them, most of the time, are very serious people who really care about getting a good outcome, and they're worth engaging with. And the third point is it's just easier than you'd think. When you look at government from the outside, it seems huge, and it seems very difficult to influence it. What strikes you as soon as you get into the policy process is how shallow it is, how few layers there are between you knocking on the door of the department on the one hand and the ministerial submission going up to cabinet on the other. It's surprisingly easy to have a surprisingly direct and important influence on the way in which Australian policy is formed. And that's perhaps particularly true of a country the size of Australia. And that means it is worth going to the effort of doing it, of trying to do it. Because in the end, good policy really does matter. And I'll finish on this thought. You know, we in Australia have been a lucky country in all kinds of ways, and one of the ways we've been a lucky country is we've generally had pretty good governments. You can disagree with all sorts of things that they've done individually, but as a general proposition, the quality of government in Australia has been quite high. Very important not to take that for granted. It's not a partisan point I'm making, because I think it's true of both parties. The quality of government in Australia, state and federal, I would say, has gone down somewhat in the last decade for reasons which are very hard to pin down. But it's a real obligation on all of us to try and help get our policy processes and the quality of our government back on track. And one thing's for sure, good science is going to be a very important part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. It's always good to follow you. Every year at ANU, we have a program at the end of the year which talks about media appearances. And every year I think I'm going to get it, and every year Hugh wins it because he does so much. Anyway, I have been a part of Science Meets Parliament since my first couple years as a postdoc here in Australia when it was first starting. For those of you tomorrow, you will have an experience which sometimes will be good, sometimes will be bad, My first parliamentarian I met was Bob Catter. He ended up not seeing me. Unfortunately, the intercom to his assistants was not turned off when he explained why he wasn't going to meet me. It was very colorful. That being said, I still get to see Bob Catter occasionally, and he's long forgotten who I was back then, although he sort of knows who I am now. So that tells you my first point, which is that policy is really a long game. You can't just expect to have an idea on a Tuesday and it to be implemented on Thursday. Hugh has built up trust over decades. My relationships with current members of Parliament goes back to when I was a young postdoc doing Science Meets Parliament. And you may be saying, oh, it won't make any difference. Well, believe it or not, a couple of those people, Julie Bishop, for example, remembers me back before I was a Nobel Prize winner or even remotely known by anyone else in Australia. They do remember if you make an impact. And so you're going to have the opportunity, hopefully tomorrow, to go in and tell people about what you're doing. One thing that we do in policy is we tend to be very negative in many respects of how we interact with politicians. And I would encourage you to try to frame what you're going to say tomorrow in a positive respect. Why? Because politicians are unusual people, at least the ones who are there for a long time. My experience is that the average young politician is actually a pretty normal person, and then they sort of self-select out to people who can survive or people who change. But they don't like negativity all the time any more than you do. What they want to hear is excitement. And the reason they're prepared to get into Science Meets Parliament is they want to be excited about science. And science is exciting. So if you can get them excited, they can convey that to their people, and they'll use your stories in their speeches. If you can remain and keep them engaged, you can build up trust and relationships. And that's one of the really important things, because you are around for 10 or 15 years and they see you grow up, and of course you're growing up with these politicians. There is a different relationship you have with the ones you've known for a long time, because they see you as an ally. And one thing that I guess slowly dawns on you after time is that the politicians you meet in their offices and talk to are quite different than the ones you see on TV, even if they have the same name. That is, they're much more human-like in their offices than they are on TV at question time, where they become pretty inhuman sometime. But in seeing that, you realize that you may have a particular political affiliation or a bent, but in the end, you're going to have a government from the different sides of politics only probably in government half the time. And if you want to have influence in policy, that trust that you build up has to be probably with both sides of politics. My experience is that if those people who align themselves to one side of politics not only are not trusted by the other side of politics, they're not particularly well trusted by the side they've aligned them with. They're seen as not being neutral. And so when you're out, for example, tweeting, and you want to have policy influence, do know your tweets will be held against you. I was rather disconcerted last year when I was meeting one of the current ministers in their office, and their staff member came out and was discussing some tweet I had made in 2009, and I realized that that person had gone through my entire 3,000 tweets over the last, since 2009. They had been looked at. They will be remembered. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't do that and shouldn't have an opinion, but do know it will change what you can and cannot do in the future. Another thing to think about is your sphere of influence. When I was a young postdoc, my sphere of influence was quite small. I was enthusiastic, I could talk to people, but my biggest set of influence that I had was going through and being able to talk to people who had, at the time, a lot more influence than I did. So, for example, Jim Peacock became the chief scientist when I was quite young, and I would talk to him about my ideas. I didn't need to go and try to get the ear of the Prime Minister. Jim was going to be far more effective at getting that message out. And so we all have our time, but some people, by virtue of winning a Nobel Prize, for example, end up being given the keys in a way that I certainly did not have before I won the Nobel Prize. And so you shouldn't see that as not being fair. You should see that as a place where you can go in and have a rational conversation with an ally who then can have the maybe slightly less rational conversation with the member of parliament on your behalf. So don't underestimate your ability to influence people through that means. And that's exactly, certainly how I worked until 2011. I think another issue for scientists is exactly what doing policy means. So policy takes two distinct forms for scientists. One is what Hugh was talking about, how we try to provide information so that people will hopefully do some sort of policy that has an evidence base behind it. And in science, this might be how do we, what's going on with the Great Barrier Reef, what's going on with climate change, what's going on with coal seam gas, and what do we know and what we don't know? How do we inform policy? But many of us here are also here in terms of an advocacy for our discipline itself, the fact that we do science. And those are very different things. And yet, in our minds, I think here today, we may well be mixing and matching them. And so we should realize that they are different. And let's talk about maybe the more contentious one, which is actually the evidence base that informs policy. Many of us are asked, as a scientist, especially in this forum, to represent not just our own area of expertise, but we have to represent expertise that goes in a wider range than maybe what we're comfortable with. And I guess what I would implore you to do is when you're talking about things outside of your area, refer not to your own knowledge, but to expert knowledge, the expert knowledge of the community. And if that expert knowledge of the community is not known to you, then you can always say, hey, I know people who work in this area, and I can get them to connect you to the right information. As a scientist, we have to get it right. We are punished severely when we get it wrong. And so it is very important that when we talk about things like climate change, the reef, or whatever, that we talk not based on our own opinions when we're not experts in that area, but talk about the scientific view of the experts. And that can be, sometimes in some issues, that view isn't very well formed. Things like the Great Barrier Reef, there's actually quite a bit of work within Australia where we've talked about the underlying drivers and reasonable consensus. Climate change is another place. So when the Academy earlier this year went through and put out a sort of a document summarizing climate change, I was an advocate for that document, but I always stated that I am representing the scientists who are experts, not my own expert opinion. And there's a difference there. So what happens if you don't agree with the expert opinion? This is where things get interesting. In my view, as scientists, we all have to ensure that we go through and argue within science about what we believe the evidence says, whether or not it is or is against the consensus view. But when we get into a policy setting, politicians do not understand the nuances of scientific debate. And so when we start taking a contentious issue where there is a strong consensus and you disagree, while I agree that you need to get out and discuss it amongst your peers, I also think you have a responsibility to, when discussing it in public fora, to acknowledge the consensus and that it disagrees with you, and talk about ways that we can further our knowledge and try to break and understand the discrepancies that you may be having. You have, as a single scientist, an incredible amount of power if you want to row against the tide. And it doesn't matter who you are in this room, from a young postdoc to a very senior academician. If you disagree with the consensus on a major issue, you will end up having a huge impact. And that is, I think, something you should be concerned about. It's not that, again, that you shouldn't express your science, but I think it's very important for the science itself to be fairly orderly, because that information is not well understood by the politicians. When we're looking at public policy with respect to science and science funding, that is something I've spent an unfortunately large amount of time over the last few months working on, simply due to the fact that things have gotten sort of a bit out of skew. But in doing so, what I've tried to do is to go through and talk to people from all walks of the policy area. So rather than go out and attempt to convey a message which is mine and mine alone, what I've tried to do is to work and listen to people from all walks and see if there's a broad consensus. So, for example, I think there was a fairly broad view within the scientific community that turning off our scientific infrastructure on the 30th of June was not a good thing. And that was something it's pretty easy to march forward on. It is an interesting question why, in the end, in this instance, the scientific establishment has been relatively effective at overturning what I think we felt was poor policy. I think partially is it was so starkly putting the field in a bad situation that it was easier to make the point. But I think ultimately it came down to essentially what I would call triangulation. And this is very important in any form of influencing policy, is that not just one person, it's having everything converge with the same basic message, which is we need to do A so that B does not happen. And if everyone can agree on what that A and B message is, it ends up making a difference. And I think, again, we often feel futile, but adding the voices of many, many people and getting the entire community to work through organizations like STA and the Academy seems to be the way that one can actually get change in this area. And finally, I want to talk about consistency. It is important when we demand a consistent policy, I don't think any of us want policies that change every 6 to 9 months, that we deliver a consistent message to government about what we need and what we don't need. And there are financial constraints. We need to have priorities. One of the things that my field of astronomy has done, because we do not produce direct products for Australian industry, and so we are not able to easily go out there and talk up ourselves in terms of our economic impact. That being said, Wi-Fi, our largest invention, did actually come from astronomy, so it's hard to predict. But what astronomers have been very good is being consistent. Every 10 years, we get together, we come up behind closed doors, have a bit of a dust-up, decide what we're going to do for the next 10 years. And then we stick to that as a community. Within science, the same approach is important. We need to prioritize. We cannot all have everything. And if we prioritize and have a consistent view of what our priorities are, then those priorities are much more likely to gain traction and be funded. Of course, you could be opportunistic and try to influence your senator or your MP, but in the end, the discipline of science loses. And so that consistency is really important. Trying to figure out a forum by which we can articulate essentially our priorities, that has been something that has been a challenge. STA has been leading something called the Research Forum for the last couple of years, and that is an area where I think that we have the best chance, where we speak with a single voice. And we don't have to articulate every single priority, but we do need to, I think, articulate a series of priorities, make them very clear, and hope that the politicians on either side will engage with those. Those priorities don't have to be specific projects. They can be programs and frameworks for how you might fund things. But in the end, it comes down to raising the profile of science so that politicians care. Now, in the past 6 months, I would say that we've done a reasonable job of that. Science is on the radar in a way that I haven't seen it many times in the 20 years I've been here. Keeping it there is hard because most of us like to go back to our labs and go and do the science. And it turns out that trying to keep science in the public view requires an enormous amount of persistence. And that persistence requires time, and time that, quite frankly, most of us feel is better to spend working on science itself. So I'm afraid I don't have a magic bullet for keeping science in the limelight, except for when we all decide that we're under enough threat that we all need to put effort into it at one time. But it is an important thing to think about how we might do better as a community. So we're going to have a Q&A time here now, and I look forward to hearing back of the stories of you all talking to your MPs, be it someone who you've never heard of or someone who's likely to be the next Prime Minister. The reality is you don't know what the future is. Treat each person, irregardless of your views of them, as someone who's an interesting sounding board. Talk broadly about policy and what you think. That's the way we build up a consensus within the community. Read widely about what we're doing in Australia and what we're doing worldwide. And I think that that is the best we can do as being a highly informed, highly engaged community. And Science Meets Parliament is a great time to take last year's efforts in that thing and to expose the government with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Madeline Birchall. I'm from DSTO Melbourne, from the Department of Defence. I just have a question for Professor White. I was interested in a comment you made about how we can engage with policymakers and how we need to know the problem. And that's always a problem for us who work in science. Often the greatest enjoyment we can get out of our work is when we go, oh, that's new, I didn't expect that result. So we might have been working on a problem and what we've discovered is something completely new and novel, not quite sure what problem it solves, but it certainly increases our understanding massively in where we were looking. So how do you think we can get that message across? Not solving a problem, but exploring the space that our science inhabits. Thanks.
Yes, look, that's a really good question, and as you might imagine, I said at the beginning I spent a lot of my career in defence sitting across the table from scientists. Many of them, well, your former colleagues or my former colleagues, your present colleagues from DSTO. It's a very good example of the challenge because, of course, in order to do the job, and it touches on something that Brian said, no scientist can afford to spend all of their time out there on what I'm calling the policy tennis court. And there are going to be times when you look at something and say, that's an interesting result, where is that leading? And you're not going to be able to say, here's the possible policy implications for it. But I'm going to say, and here I'm going to say this partly as a former defence official, making sure that as much as possible the choices that are made, and I think particularly true of DSTO because it sits in such a policy context, making sure that the choices that are made about which promising lines of inquiry are pursued and which ones aren't, has to be informed by the broader questions about what is it we're trying to achieve. Now, I would say, and this is very much my core line of work, there are some very clear operational questions, military operational questions I mean, which Australia has to address over the next 20 or 30 years. And I don't think it's very hard to say, here are some specific technological issues. I mean, I don't know, this might be where you're working for that matter, but for example, underwater detection, huge issue. I'd be very happy to see lots of resources go into pursuing even quite obscure, not very promising lines of inquiry, because getting a better result on that whole area is so important to us. But that gets back to my point I made. To governors to choose have to make choices about that. You need to make sure the choices, at least I would say in DSTO's case, but perhaps more broadly, are guided by the broader strategic priorities of the organisation, and not just, by, that is so interesting, because that's good fun, do that on your weekend, but in the end, that's not the way you should be spending those of the taxpayers' dollars which are appropriated for the defence of the Commonwealth.
My name's Diane. I'm just putting something out there because I think what you've just said contradicts what we've been told this morning, in that by accident you've discovered Wi-Fi because you're looking for something else.
Yes.
This morning we were told not to let policy drive science, but what you're saying is that policy needs to drive science. There's a lot of really important blue sky research that needs to be done in order for those discoveries to be found, and often by looking directly at that you won't see it.
Yes.
You can't see the forest through the trees.
Yes.
So I'm not sure I completely agree with what you've said at this point.
Well, I'll start and say that there are different has many different uses, and there's lots of applied research done in Australia, a lot more than the basic research. So I think what Hugh was alluding to is that in defense you have very specific strategic goals of what the research is to achieve. And if you get a piece of blue sky, that maybe is not what DSTO should be doing if it's unrelated to their core missions. I think an interesting policy problem is how we get those ideas out of DSTO and into something else where they can be pursued, because in the university system, parts of CSIRO, we really do things because they're interesting, specifically to build up those ideas that can then maybe be used somewhere else. And so that is a real policy problem that I see as facing this nation, is that we are siloed scientifically very badly across universities, DSTO, CSIRO. There's not a lot of interaction there. So that's a problem. But I do understand that if you're doing applied research to achieve thing A, you don't really get the opportunity to jump off that path to A like you do in a university where it's much more open.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think it's a matter of what kind of scientific organisation are you? Why do you exist? What's the smart thing for you to be doing? Some people in Australia should be happy to take on whatever the basic science was that led us to Wi-Fi. I don't think it should be DSTO. And I'm going to say something which probably a few DSTO people in the room. There is a problem for Australia that I think it's still the case. The second biggest in terms of funding and personnel scientific research organisation in the country is embedded in the Defence Organisation. Because I don't think the Defence Department's scientific research organisation should be pursuing low probability, high return, interesting ideas. There's plenty of things that are much higher probability of return that really need to be looked at. And so I think I would say if the challenge is to make sure that our scientific research community is structured in such a way that the people who should be doing that are being funded to do that, and the people who are being funded to provide relatively direct support to our military capabilities are doing their job.
Yes, my name is Richard Arculus. I'm from the Australian National University. My question really is to Brian. From your perspective now, Brian, where you've got to in your career, do you think the channels of advice to policymakers are good enough that we can feel satisfied that the academy, the chief scientist, all the structures that exist, or would you think that there's some ways we can improve this, that there's some other ways of harnessing the abilities, the advice that could be there, but maybe latent and not fully exploited in our country at the moment?
Yeah, so when it comes to scientific evidence, I think we are far from exploiting what we're capable of doing. Within the United States, there's something called the National Research Council, which is essentially given the remit to answer questions that the government, any department might have on any issue. And so that, you get 75, 80 of those a year. I write expert advice for those already for the US. I am never asked to do anything like that in Australia. Instead, what you have is, individuals, think tanks, people in a department go out and provide advice, as I said, on an ad hoc basis. There's not a structure in place to provide that. The chief scientist has a role to do that, but the chief scientist is one person with an office of about 10 or 12 people, and does not really have the remit to go out and answer hard scientific questions. It's just not something that the chief scientist is given. So I think there's a structure that's missing in this country, which is hard questions where the government needs scientific advice on, so it can provide evidence for policy, and to have an organization that is funded to do that uses the entire community's expert opinion and makes essentially recommendations in those spaces.
Thanks. I think, do we have a question on this side? Oh, there we go.
Hello, Emma Johnston from the University of New South Wales. So scientists are often asked to give advice at both state and federal government levels, and sometimes sit on committees. And it's possible that politicians are actually getting better in training and using that advice to their advantage to back their policy positions. I'm wondering if you can reflect on whether or not the advantage of being on the inside giving advice outweighs the potential independence that might be lost as an external public voice and a scientist who's speaking in the media.
Yes, very good question.
Not yours.
Oh, well, it's a really good question, and not a question that exists just for scientists, if I can put it that way. Because in some ways it goes back to the very important point that Brian made, and that is that one of the arts of being an effective interlocutor, an effective influencer of policymakers is to be trusted by them, of course. And they're not going to trust people who are out there, whether it's in tweeting or on op-eds or whatever, taking views which they find uncongenial. On the other hand, if you just limit yourself to talking behind closed doors, I'll be blunt, it makes it that much easier for them to ignore you. And so I do think, my own experience at least, and I think it would be transferable to scientists as well, is that it makes a big difference to your impact in your private conversations if you're engaging in the public debate as well. But in engaging in the public debate, you've got to be very scrupulous about the way you do it. Most public debate about policy questions contains quite a strong element of partisanship, and a lot of it contains quite a strong element of what you might broadly call personal abuse of politicians. And the challenge is to find a way to write about policy or to speak about policy which is not overtly partisan, which again goes very much back to Brian's point, and also is, in particular, doesn't abuse politicians even when they're doing things really stupidly. So I personally think you can be a kind of an insider-outsider. Borders are very powerful places. If you can sit on and they're very dangerous places to sit, but they're very profitable. Look at Venice, sort of halfway between Europe and Asia. If you can sit on that boundary and be half of an insider and half of an outsider, you can have the benefits of both, then it can work very well for you. But it's dangerous, and it also requires a certain degree of deftness. So my way of resolving that is to be as active as I can in the public debate, but to be very guarded about the way I do that so that it doesn't make it harder for me to have conversations inside. And in fact, I think it's not in the end that hard to do. I'm very active in the public debate, but I also spend a lot of time talking inside government to people, and the fact that people have already read what I've said publicly does, start to get the ball rolling, and they kind of have to pay a bit more attention to what I say because they can see that I'm part of the public debate as well.
Just to say, that's exactly the same way I approach it. So.
We had one more question on this side.
I'm Flora Salim, from a computer scientist from RMIT University. I have two questions. The first one, just alluding to the previous question over there about the need for having a structure, for us to be able to convey our ideas. My question, the first one, is whether we need another forum, which is parliamentarians mid-science, where they actually need to learn about how do you actually apply all these scientific contributions that this community have been making to actually politics, and if that is to be done, how, whether you think that will be effective. And the second is, I believe the Australian scientific communities have made amazing contributions in terms of tools, technology, innovation that could be used for data-driven, evidence-driven policy making. But how do we even put those things forward to politicians that could actually use it?
All right, I'm going to let you take the second one. I'll take the first one. So I think the reality is we elect politicians. We sometimes unelect them.
By the day.
Yeah, New South Wales, we hire them, but that's interesting. So we're not going to turn them into people that they're not. We need to provide a funnel of information. And ultimately, the Westminster system should provide strong people to make policies on behalf of the government. And that group should be able to go out and interact with the scientific community. And I would say, some of them would say we already do that. I'm arguing that they don't actually. Compared to the US, the ability for scientists to input into policy is orders of magnitude less here, given, as I said, I do 10 times more in the US and I don't even live there. So there's something funny going on in terms of how we're not utilizing that. So I don't think we can expect to train the politicians to be able to deal with scientific stuff directly. I think we need to create the structure to feed the information in. Hopefully they will ask the bureaucratic capability they have to use that information to develop policies, which then they would use and have a contest of ideas, which one fits what they see as being the most important from their own viewpoints. On the second one.
Yes, in fact, I think the answer is somewhat similar to the answer that Brian's given you to the first question. The fact is that, how do we make sure that politicians and other policymakers reach out and incorporate science as well as possible in their decision making? Well, in the end, it's a matter of quality of decisions. We're not. The really important thing is that the governments end up making the best decisions they can. And in a democratic system, the incentives that are provided to make sure that happens are the ones that are provided through the ballot box. And so in the end, it's our function as citizens, rather than as scientists, to try and impel our politicians to make the best decisions possible. That sounds easy. Actually, it's quite hard because we have to overcome all sorts of instincts of our own. Does one want to get rid of, negative gearing on interest on home loans? Well, probably, I'm not an economist, but I think there's probably a pretty good argument for getting rid of us, but nobody wants to do that. So, we make the same mistakes that politicians do. We don't really make our decisions about what we want them to do based on evidence as clearly as we should. So I think, in the end, there needs to be mechanisms of the sort that Brian described to improve the permeability of the boundary between science and policy to get those in. And it's very much a feature of the US system of government that it is much more open in general. The Australian system of government, coming as it does so directly from Westminster, still has a lot of the spirit of a royal court. But we are governing this country and the rest of you are subjects, and you, the rest of you, are not inside this club, don't have much to say about it. Whereas the US system really is the obverse of that, and our whole idea of government, of the people, by the people, for the people, is really reflected in the fact, although I think the US system of government at the moment has got lots of problems, it remains very open to ideas. I mean, in my own case, for example, I have more luck talking to American policymakers about some of the rather radical ideas I have about strategic questions in Asia than I do to Australian policymakers, because the US policy process is just that much more open. But for us we need to build those mechanisms, but to make sure that politicians use them in order to support the best possible policy outcomes, that's a job for the voter. And there's not much way around that, if you know what I mean. We just have to hope that our incentive system is there to encourage them to make the best decisions they can. As I say, the record for the last few years has been not very strong.
Got time for just one last question.
Rob Robinson from ANSTO and the Australian Institute of Physics. I've got a question for Brian. My impression is that the present government, and to some extent the Labor government before it, have been wrestling with the return on investment from, science funding in general and government science funding in particular. And I realise that Ian Chubb will have something to say about this, tomorrow. But do you have any advice for us in, the sorts of things we might say to parliamentarians that we meet tomorrow, or indeed, how we might engage in helping to think through this question of whether, there's bang for the scientific buck?
So I'll answer this on the basis of being married to an economist who looks at this type of problem. It is very, very difficult to remember to measure the return of investment of fundamental or even applied research, because the returns come very long in in the future relative to if you're a business, and also in a very wide variety of ways. It's very there are all sorts of interesting ways that when we invest in research that the government gets returns. It's not just a product, it's the training of people, it's international mobility, it's all these things that are hard to add up. That being said, whenever anyone does it, and there is an economist at the University of New South Wales, Kevin Fox, who has gone through and done the biggest analysis of the Australian economy on this front, and he finds very high what he would call spillovers, productivity spillovers from investment within basic research, effectively, within our research agencies and government research organizations. That means that when every dollar that the government spends, it's getting many more dollars in return from that. So the economics analysis that has been done always are very positive, but it is very difficult to say you get 56 cents on the dollar. But relative to anything else the government spends, the actual economic return seems to be quite high, if quite difficult to quantify.
Can I just add one thought to that? And that is, it depends a lot on what image you have of the Australian economy. And as long as your primary image of the Australian economy continues to be that it takes advantage of this extraordinary continent and what that provides to us, so to speak, for free, then it takes a certain leap of the imagination to see why, inventing Wi-Fi makes a difference. Whereas if you're Switzerland, then you're in no doubt that the only way you're going to survive is through a whole lot of very sophisticated innovations, some of them financial, some of them technical. But that kind of approach to thinking about your economic future comes much more naturally to them. And one of the challenges that Australia has faced for a long time, has been distracted because of the resources boom, but I think we'll now find ourselves refacing up to, is reimagining the Australian economy in ways that make that kind of calculation, that kind of economics, much more relevant to our choices. We're a long way from that at the moment, I think.
And with that, I think I'll ask you to join me in thanking both of them.